Hi, everyone. I have gotten some questions about research, which is a topic that was covered in Intro to Psych. Some of you, it may have been a while since you took Intro to Psych. So I am going to try and do my really quick refresher of research, particularly in psychology and any of the social sciences. I'm going to try and do this quickly. I'm really going to go through this slideshow fast and focus on sort of the end. But I want to just talk through it a little bit, and then I will put this actual presentation in um, in the Blackboard page so that you can access the links if you want to watch some of these. So if you have any questions about this, shoot me an email, raise your hand in the ask a question section, or even bring it up in the discussion. Okay. So some of this is just, again, intro stuff. So I'm just going to go through this. These are some old pictures of my daughter. Psychology is the study of mental activity and behavior. Behavior is really easy to observe. What is she doing here with her dolls? Mental activity is a little bit more difficult. So what on earth is she thinking here in this swimsuit, umbrella, typical goofball 2.5-year-old outfit that we will talk about when we talk about this fun stage of preschool development. So these are covered pretty well. The modern perspectives of psychology, we're focusing here. Again, this is from Intro to Psych, but we're in this class obviously focusing on developmental psych. But whatever you're focusing on in these social sciences, critical thinking is really important. So you always want to ask, what is the evidence that you're presenting to me? What are you being asked to believe or accept? What is the evidence that you're presenting? Where does that come from? What's the science behind what this statement is? So, some of the controversies that social science and, just regular science look at, some of these controversies. Do vaccines cause autism? Now, this is sort of an outdated controversy. There's plenty of scientific evidence that there is no link between vaccines and autism. Other things that researchers look at, do gun laws prevent gun violence? Do they reduce gun violence? Does Mozart make babies smarter? Nowadays, what about masks protecting us from COVID? And this is something you can see the research has developed just in the last couple of months. In the beginning, we weren't really sure. Now it's pretty clear from the scientific research that the masks are a protective factor in protecting us from COVID. Some of these things related to psychology that have been studied, about goal making and stress management and what's the best way to learn, all of these things have been studied by social scientists in using these research methods that we're about to talk about. Okay, so again, refresher from Intro to Psych, where we look at all types of research. Always, you want to remember, ethics is the most important thing. You cannot harm your subjects. You can't physically harm them. Obviously, you can't emotionally harm them. Subjects need to give consent. Parents of the subjects or guardians of the subjects need to give consent, and then you can do your research. So in psychology, we look at 3 particular types of research: descriptive, correlational, and experimental. And I list them here in degrees of difficulty. So descriptive research, we'll talk about that first, is really easy to do. Correlational is a little bit harder, and experimental is the most difficult, but it's the only one that you can show cause and effect. Experimental research is the only way that you can say this caused this, okay? A caused B, or whatever it is that you're looking at. These IRBs, these institutional review boards, are present at every institution, every hospital or school where research is done. And the purpose of these boards is to look at the type of research that an individual wants to do and make sure that these subjects, human or otherwise, are protected. Obviously, there are different guidelines for humans and animal research. So whenever you're doing research, you want to define the variables, particularly in experimental research. Those variables are the things that change. So things that either the researchers are changing and then looking at the effect of that, So in a study of caffeine, if you're looking at caffeine and school performance, the amount of caffeine is in that example would be the independent variable, and the performance is the dependent variable. And again, we'll talk about what those mean again in a minute. The operational definition just means that we are going to try and define these variables very specifically. So you would use milligrams of caffeine, and how many points exactly on a scale you're looking at for school performance or whatever. An example, a very specific example of a type of smiling is this type called Duchenne smiling, and you can see it again here. This is my favorite subject. This is Maddie when she was little, and this is Duchenne smiling, is a legitimate, genuine smile. You see it a lot in little kids, when they're not faking it, their eyes are involved, their whole face is smiling. That's a Duchenne smile. It's a very specific type of smile. So again, this is a part of my sort of intro to psych, more involved look at what research is. But, we're from birth, we are born as little scientists. We're immediately trying to figure out the world around us. And again, we'll look at that more when we talk about the early stages of human development. So the scientific method is this very specific set of steps that we have to try to figure out whatever it is, whatever the problem is we're trying to solve, whatever human behavior we're trying to figure out. We use the scientific method. We come up with a hypothesis, what we think is happening, and we conceptualize the problem. We base that hypothesis, what we think is going to happen, usually based on a theory. So in this example over here, the learning theory says that reinforcement increases behavior. When we give a reward, we typically see that behavior increase. That's a part of the learning theory. So my educated guess, my hypothesis would be, if I were looking at motivating studying behavior, if I gave you $100 for every 100%, this is not going to happen. I'm still on a teacher's salary. But my guess would be that you would do better in class. All right. And then I want to start doing my experiment and giving out those $100 bills and start collecting data. So what happens when I do that? Do I start to get more 100s in the class? And then I would plot that on a graph, look at my data, and then make some conclusions. And then go to the college and say, listen, if we start giving out $100, our students will do better. And we'll see if they're going to run with that. Okay, so again, this is just... So the three types of research. Descriptive research, if you remember from Intro to Psych, is really easy to do. It involves observing and describing and typically recording behavior. All right, so all we're doing is gathering information. It can be systematic. It can be done in a laboratory. We can be looking for particular things. You can do naturalistic observation, which is observing individuals in their own environment. And my favorite naturalistic observer, if any of you know who Dr. Goodall is, she is a researcher, a primatologist. I'm going to go over here to her.
60, it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools, so that we were defined when I was growing up as man the tool maker. So I sent Louis Leakey a telegram about what I'd seen.
So this is Dr. Jane. She studied primates in their natural environment, and she learned an enormous amount. She's a really interesting individual if you want to go in and look at some of her research. But that was all descriptive research. She wasn't making the primates do anything, and she wasn't involving herself really in their lives, but she was just observing what they were doing. Excuse me. Surveys and interviews can also be descriptive research. Many of us have participated in those and standardized tests. And again, those are really good at just gathering lots of information. But they can't tell us why one thing causes another or how things are related. Okay? If you click on this link in the attached PowerPoint, or the PowerPoint will be below this video presentation, you can look back at Phineas Gage if you might remember his case study. A case study is also descriptive research. It's an intense look at one individual or a small group of individuals. This is B.F. Skinner. We may talk about him later in the developmental chapter. If you want to look up this experiment that he was doing, this is his own child. I believe this is his daughter. That is a rather interesting experiment that he was looking at. Correlational research. Okay, so correlational research is used a lot in psychology, so it's really important to understand what correlational research is. This describes how strongly two events are related. It does not show cause and effect. All we're looking at is that these two factors occur strongly together or occur frequently together. The correlational coefficient is the value, the numeric value of how strongly these things are related, and it's rated on a scale of -1 to 0 to +1. Okay, so if you remember from way back when we had number lines in school, it's a correlation of 0 means that there's no relationship. There's just nothing related about these two factors that we're looking at. A correlational coefficient that gets close to 1, so many times you'll see like 0.85 or 0.7, that's a higher correlation. It means that these two things occur more frequently together. In the negative side, negative correlational coefficients mean that they happen in an opposite fashion. And I'll give you some examples in a minute that I hope will make that more clear. So positive correlations, those correlations that are closer to that positive 1, both factors increase or decrease together. Negative correlation, those numbers that are closer to -1, as one goes up, basically the other goes down, or vice versa. As one goes down, the other goes up. Some examples of positive correlation. The more you study, the higher your grades. Now, this is just means that the two things are related. Does that necessarily mean that studying more increases your grades? No. It's not a cause and effect. We don't see that as a cause and effect relationship. We just know that they're more frequently seen together. The more you work, the more you make. The less you eat, the less you weigh. And the less you practice, the less you learn. Okay, so these are things that are frequently seen together, but because they're a correlation, they're just frequently seen together. We still cannot say that one causes another. In order to say that, you have to do an experiment, and we'll talk about experimental research in a minute. Negative correlations basically go the opposite. So the more you work, the less you play. The more you spend, the less you save. The less a baby is held, the more they cry. Okay, that's an opposite correlation. The less a baby is held, the more they cry. Does that mean that so the inverse of that would be the more a baby is held, the less they cry. Now, if you've ever been around a colicky baby, you can say that that's not necessarily the case. Holding a colicky baby does not necessarily make them cry less. So again, it's something that's frequently seen together, but we can't say necessarily that one causes the other. Okay? Most importantly, correlation, just because two things go together does not mean that one causes the other. Correlation does not prove causation. Okay, so just jumping back a little bit. So just because two things go together doesn't mean one causes the other. Like I said, one of my favorite examples of this, of a negative correlation, is typically the lower the temperature, the more the clothes we put on, right? On a day like today where it's freezing cold, I'm like wearing 17 layers, right? Because I'm always cold anyway. So whenever the weather's cold, that causes us to wear more clothing, right? So how do we explain something like this? Right? So these are the Radio City Rockettes. This is a Christmas special in New York City, typically mid-December. It's usually freezing cold, right? So why aren't they? If the weather causes us to wear more clothes, then they should be fully dressed in snowmobile suits, right? Because it's most likely freezing. If you look in the crowd, everybody else is dressed very warmly. No, there's some other factor that's making them dressed like this. You know, they're Rockettes. They've worked their whole life for this. This is how they do their show. So there are other factors involved. It's not just a solid cause and effect, but there's a correlation, right? Everybody else in the crowd, you're more likely to see people dressed in sort of typical winter wear. So, does smoking cause cancer? That's the big question, right? Most people say yes. If we look at these smoking rates, so these are cancer deaths and smoking rates in the different states. This is pretty old information. But again, this is, where you see higher rates of smoking, so higher over here, the cancer rates are also higher, right? And where we see low rates of smoking, the cancer rates are very low. So does that mean that smoking causes cancer? We can't say that, because the only way to show causation, the only way to say that A causes B, smoking causes cancer, is to do an experiment. And that to do an experiment, you have to take two separate groups of people and randomly assign one group to do the sort of bad behavior, the behavior that you're studying, the smoking. So we can't randomly assign a group of people to smoke for 20 or 30 years. It's just not ethical. Remember, the first rule of research is always you cannot purposefully harm your subjects. Now, does that mean that we can't take subjects who are already smoking at high rates and then look at their cancer rates? Yes, we're not invasively telling them they have to do this. They're doing it voluntarily. So we have good, solid correlational data that smoking leads to higher rate, or is associated, I should say, with higher rates of cancer. And actually nowadays, medically and on the scientific side of this, researchers have taken cellular data and looked at the cells and shown that cells exposed to these toxins in cigarettes lead to cancerous changes basically in the cells. And also the correlational data on smoking is really overwhelming, that most scientists will say that yes, we do believe that smoking causes cancer. But again, nobody has ever done an actual good, solid, randomly assigned, very long research study to see that smoking does cause cancer. And again, that goes back to ethics. You can't ethically, morally cause people to do things that are harmful. So we've seen violations of these ethical guidelines in many cases, from Dr. Mengele, who was an infamous doctor in Nazi Germany who performed countless medical experiments on members or individuals in concentration camps. The Stanley Milgram study is an interesting one. Milgram was a very famous psychologist who did his research, and he was actually trying to understand what occurred in Nazi Germany. Why were so many individuals obedient to people in authority? And he designed this experiment that you can watch here at this Khan Academy. This is a great resource on YouTube. Any of these Khan Academy videos are going to be good, solid, scientifically backed videos. And this explains the Milgram experiment pretty well. So if you want to take a look at that, please do so. The Tuskegee syphilis study and some of the instances at Willowbrook, which was a home for individuals with cognitive disability. Okay, sorry everybody. I'm trying to do this like in the pre-dinner hours. It's a little busy. Here's another. This was a book I read. Um, this is a book about a woman named Henrietta Lacks. Scientists used her tissue to perform many experiments after her death without really her consent or her family's consent. So again, if you click on the link of the PowerPoint, or if you could, yeah, you're probably best to go into the PowerPoint from this video, and you can click on this link or just look up her book. And I believe they're making it into a movie also. Another example of medical ethics not being properly used. Okay, so our final type of research, experimental research, again, it is the most difficult type to do, but it also is the only one that allows us to show cause and effect between two variables. So in experimental research, we manipulate the two factors, we manipulate the independent variable and see what its effect is on the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the one that's manipulated or changed, and then the dependent variable is what we measure, what happens as a result of that. So good ways to identify the independent and the dependent variable. The independent causes the dependent. Typically, a good experiment should have experimental and control groups. So in a study, you want to see what the effect of the actual treatment or medication is. So you give the experimental medication to one group, and you give the other group something that looks like the medication or the treatment, but isn't actually the medication or treatment. And this is to look at the placebo effect. So if you remember, the placebo effect is just that it's what can happen just sometimes they call it a white lab coat syndrome. Somebody in a lab coat, or somebody that looks like a doctor or a nurse, or some sort of a pharmacist or professional, gives you something that says this is going to make you feel better, and that effect alone can sometimes make people feel better. It's not the actual medication, it's just the belief that this is going to work. So when possible, researchers will use a placebo, a fake medication. A sugar pill usually is one of the most common things, to rule that out. Is it, just sort of the mental effect of believing that something's going to work, or is it the actual medication that you're going to charge an enormous amount of money for, most likely, if it's a new medication? So you need to make sure that it actually does work. Double-blind experiments just mean that if I'm the experimenter giving you the medication that I'm testing, I don't know what I'm giving you, and you don't know what you're getting. Okay, so again, in the very beginning, to make this research ethical, I have to give you some idea of what you might be ingesting, what the research is kind of about, but I won't tell you when I give you the pill if you're getting the sugar pill or are you getting, let's say we're studying caffeine, I'm going to give it to you in a pill. Experiments have been done with, regular coffee and decaf coffee, and see, do people report that they feel better when they get decaf coffee? I always tell my husband, don't ever do this to me, because it's not a pretty sight to see me without caffeine in the morning. These experiments have been done with real beer and what's called near beer, which is beer that tastes like beer and looks like beer, but doesn't actually have very much alcohol in it at all. What do you think might happen when that experiment was done? Do people have the same or similar reaction to fake beer as they do to real beer? All kind of interesting things. Actually, studies have been done with fake acupuncture needles to see if there's a placebo effect for acupuncture. And it has been shown that for some conditions and illnesses, real acupuncture really does work. There really is an improvement over fake acupuncture needles. So it's not just the placebo effect. Okay. So again, the best thing you can do as far as research is concerned is this double-blind experiment where I don't know what you're getting and you don't know what you're getting until the experiment's over. People are randomly assigned to these groups, whether they get the real treatment or the fake treatment, the placebo. And then we look at what happens and examine the research after that. That's kind of considered the gold standard for research, but we can't always do it. So, we can't always do that with smoking, and we can't do it with things that are, dangerous to individuals' health. So I hope this gave you a brief sort of refresher course on research. If you need any more information, or if you'd like me to do another video like this, just raise your hand in the Ask a Question section or send me an email, and I will do my best.